I'd like to begin with a question. Why do people behave the way they do? Not just individuals, entire groups, entire communities, entire societies. Why are some societies peaceful, prosperous and cooperative, while others become divided, violent and destructive? Why do some people overcome enormous obstacles and thrive, while others, often with the best intentions, repeatedly make choices that damage themselves and others? And perhaps the most important question of all, if our goal is to create a more civilised, more peaceful and more positive society, what is the most effective way to change human behaviour? For many years I believed what I suspect many people believe. I believed that behaviour was, one, primarily a matter of choice, and if someone behaved badly, they should simply choose to behave better. If someone was unhealthy, they should make healthier choices. If someone was violent, intolerant or destructive, they should choose to stop. In other words, I believed that behaviour itself was the problem. But over time and through observing individuals, families, organisations and societies, I began to think that this explanation was incomplete, because when you look carefully at human behaviour, something remarkable becomes apparent. Human behaviour rarely occurs in isolation. It appears to emerge from something deeper, and that observation led me to develop a simple proposition that I want to share with you tonight. My proposition is this: environment shapes your attitude. Your attitude shapes your behaviour, and your behaviour determines the quality of our society. Now, I appreciate this may sound obvious, but I think we often underestimate just how powerful our environments really are. Every environment teaches us something. Families teach us, schools teach us, communities teach us, religions teach us, political movements teach us, workplaces teach us, social media teaches, and friendship groups teach us. When the physical spaces we inhabit teach us how to think, how to feel, and ultimately how to behave, whether we realise it or not, we are constantly absorbing lessons from the environments around us. These lessons become our attitudes. Our attitudes become the lens through which we interpret reality. And those attitudes in turn shape our behaviour. Consider two children. One grows up in an environment of encouragement, security, opportunity and affection. The other grows up in an environment of neglect, instability, violence or hopelessness. Would we expect these two individuals to develop identical attitudes about themselves, about other people and about the world? I doubt it. Of course not. And if their attitudes differ, should we expect their behaviours to be identical? Again, probably not. Yet something curious happens when we become adults. When adults behave badly, we often stop asking questions about the environment. Instead, we focus almost entirely on the individual. We ask, what's wrong with that person? Perhaps a better question is, what environment shaped the attitudes that produce that behaviour? Because I believe that if we want to understand behaviour, we must first understand the attitudes behind it. And if we want to understand attitudes, we must understand the environments that created them. Let's look at some examples. Why do gangs exist? Why do cults exist? Why does political extremism emerge? Why does online radicalisation occur? Why do some organisations develop toxic workplace cultures? I don't believe these things happen because people simply wake up one morning and decide to become destructive. Rather, individuals enter environments that gradually shape how they perceive themselves and the world around them. Those perceptions become attitudes, and those attitudes eventually produce behaviours that, from within that environment, may appear logical, justified, and even morally correct. One of the most confronting examples of this principle can be found in violent extremist movements. Now, to be absolutely clear, I'm not referring to mainstream religious beliefs, nor to the billions of peaceful people around the world who practice their faith without violence. I'm referring specifically to extremist ideological environments. If an individual spends years immersed in an environment that consistently teaches that certain groups are enemies, that violence is justified, and that martyrdom is honourable, and that grievances should define one's identity, should we be surprised when some individuals eventually commit acts of terrorism? From the perspective of any model, their behaviour is not random. It is not inexplicable. It is the tragic but predictable consequences of attitudes that have been shaped by a particular environment. And importantly, this principle is not unique to one ideology. The same process can be observed in white supremacist movements, in political extremism, in violent gangs, in destructive cults, and increasingly in online echo chambers where algorithms continuously reinforce particular worldwide views. Different environments, different attitudes, different behaviours. The same underlying mechanism. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I am not suggesting that individuals do not have personal responsibility. Of course they do. Human beings possess agency, we make choices, and we are accountable for our actions. But I'm suggesting that if our goal is to understand why behaviours emerge, and more importantly, how to change them, then focusing exclusively on personal responsibility may be insufficient. Imagine trying to eliminate weeds by cutting off the leaves. You might achieve temporary success, but unless you change the conditions that allow the weeds to grow, they will simply return. I believe human behaviour often operates in exactly the same way. We spend enormous amounts of time attempting to modify behaviour. We punish, we lecture, we shame, we regulate, we demand that people do better. Sometimes this works, often it does not. Because we are attempting to change the visible outcome without addressing the conditions that produce it. If my proposition is correct, then perhaps the most effective way to change behaviour is not to attack behaviour itself. Perhaps the most effective strategy is to change the environment that shapes attitudes. We already do this in many areas of society. Consider public health. For decades we told people to exercise more. Then what do? We built parks, we built walking tracks, we built bicycle paths to try to change the environment. We created environments where healthy choices became easier. Consider education. We don't simply tell children to learn. We create schools, classrooms, libraries and learning environments designed to encourage curiosity and achievement. Consider workplace culture. Successful organisations don't simply demand respect. They don't demand good behaviour. They create environments where respect, accountability and cooperation become the norm. The same principle applies to families, to communities and to nations, and perhaps to civilization itself. If we want a society characterised by civility, responsibility, cooperation, tolerance and respect, then we cannot simply demand those behaviours. We must consciously create environments that cultivate the attitudes that naturally give rise to those behaviours. Because every environment is teaching something. Every family, every classroom, every workplace, every religious institution, every political movement, every online platform, every neighbourhood, every nation. The question is not whether environments shape people. The question is, what kind of people are your environments shaping? And I believe this question has profound implications. It changes how we think about crime. It changes how we think about education. It changes how we think about radicalisation. It changes how we think about politics. It changes how we think about parenting. And perhaps most importantly, it changes how we think about ourselves. Because all of us exist within environments that influence our attitudes every single day. The books we read, the media that we consume, the people we spend time with, the communities we belong to, and the conversations we have. They are all shaping us. So perhaps the most important question we can ask ourselves is not how do I force myself to behave differently, but rather what environment am I creating around myself? Because if environment shapes attitudes and attitude shapes behaviour, then changing our environment may be one of the most powerful tools for changing our lives. And perhaps the same principle applies to societies. If we generally want a more civilised world, a more peaceful world and a more positive world, then perhaps we should spend less time asking, how do we force people to behave better? and more time asking what kind of environments are we creating. Because if my proposition is correct, and I believe it is, that environment shapes attitude and attitude shapes behaviour, then the most powerful way to change people's behaviour is not to fight behaviour itself. It is to create environments in which positive attitudes can naturally develop. And if we can do that, we may not simply change individual lives. We may change societies, and that's what I believe could be the best outcome. Thank you very much for listening.